everyone. A warm welcome. Thank you very much for coming. Now, I think if anyone had suggested that 6 months ago, or if anyone had thought about the Telegraph running a front page declaring England home rule central to Tory plans, you would have sat there and laughed and thought you weren't really sure where that was coming from. The last few weeks, the Scotland referendum have been something of a whirlwind. Some will tell you that it has changed the political landscape forever. Some will tell you it'll all be over by Christmas and we'll be exactly back to where we start on. For election geeks, those of us who get terribly excited by council by-elections and parish defections, this was something of a revelation. Suddenly, the public were genuinely as excited as we usually get. The atmosphere in Scotland was febrile, but actually the atmosphere all over this country and other parts of the world were quite impassioned too. So the question that we're putting to our guests and the questions that we're going to discuss this afternoon is what now for Scotland? Has that changed everything? Will it change nothing? Has it made us all question our identities, or was this a sort of a political escape that will be quickly buried? What we're going to do is hear from each of our guests in turn for 5 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the floor, and we welcome your questions, of course. Just a couple of housekeeping points. This is all on record. You're very welcome to tweet, and the hashtag is #AskCH. And if you're asking questions, we've got roving mics. We just ask you to be clear and concise. But I'm going to ask John Curtis, a man we have just come to term on Newsnight, the polling god, to kick us off for 5 minutes. John, no pressure then.
Well, as I always point out to people, Emily, the Pope may be infallible, but God is not. So I still feel reasonably happy. Let me well, first of all, I'm going to still tell you a little bit about what happened, and particularly a little bit about the role of foreign and defence issues in the referendum, given the nature of the audience, and then move on more directly to the question about what next. The first thing just to say, just to underline the last thing Emily said, not only was the atmosphere febrile, but people voted. You have to remember the verdict in this referendum was a verdict from 85% of the registered electorate, and the registered electorate was a record 97% of Scotland's population. So this is not a referendum whose result can be ignored. And it is also a referendum result which, although at the end was somewhat larger no vote than the final polls anticipated, it was still a much smaller no vote that was anticipated for most of the campaign. And this is not something I can prove, but I would lead you to think about, if there had been a border poll in Northern Ireland at the moment, would it have been the case that as many as 45% of people would have voted to join the Republic of Ireland? And that therefore probably we now have to regard, for the time being at least, Scotland's continued membership of the United Kingdom and of the Union as fragile as Northern Ireland's continued membership and as problematic. Now, how did we... I'm not going to get into why it ended up at 45%. Let me say a little bit about the role of the European Union and Trident debates, both of which, of course, were prominent, particularly the European Union debate during the campaign. And simply to say, and I'm sorry to disappoint people in this audience, but actually neither of these was terribly important in determining whether people were yes or no voters. It is true that Scotland is somewhat more Europhile than is the rest of the United Kingdom, and you might therefore anticipate that some people might have been persuaded to vote no on the grounds that therefore Scotland's membership of the European Union would not be questioned, or alternatively to vote yes on the grounds that they would avoid the threat of the Tory promised referendum on the UK's membership of the European Union. But the truth is that although Scotland is somewhat more Europhile, the typical Scot is actually a Cameronian on attitudes towards Europe. That is, around 3/5 of people in Scotland either wish to leave the European Union or, for the most part, think that Scotland, stroke the UK, should remain inside the European Union, but could it please boss us around rather less. And to that extent, therefore, it was always rather unrealistic of either side to anticipate that many people in Scotland were going to vote either yes or no on the grounds they wish to keep Scotland's membership of the Union. There aren't enough committed European unions north of the border for that to be crucial. And if you look at the views of yes and no voters on attitudes towards Europe, they were virtually identical to each other. So it was a great elite level issue about tactics, but absolutely useless as an issue for dealing with voters. Trident, of course, was arguably the most important strategic issue as far as the rest of the United Kingdom is concerned, so far as Scotland's continued membership is concerned. But again, the actual picture so far as public opinion is not as clear as you might anticipate. Work we've done on the social attitude surveys, basically crucial message number one is that both Scotland and England and Wales are pretty much divided down the middle on their views as to whether or not the United Kingdom should or should not be a country that has nuclear weapons. The balance of opinion is very slightly opposed in Scotland. It's very slightly in favour in England and Wales, but it's not a dramatic divergence. And although it's true that yes supporters were somewhat more likely to be opposed to nuclear weapons, it's not that dramatic. And in fact, the no vote was split almost 50-50 in its attitudes to whether or not it's in the principle of the UK being in favour of nuclear weapons. So again, to that extent at least, Trident, I mean, it's crucial to the views of SNP activists, but it's not clear that it was central to the wider body of voters. Okay, so let's just say a little bit about the role of defence and foreign affairs issues so far as the public is concerned in the referendum. Where has it left us? The referendum campaign has left us in a situation where, A, the unionist parties in the end found themselves required, at least from their perspective, we can argue about whether they needed to do it, but they found themselves in the end feeling required to go much further in terms of at least nailing down that there would be more devolution for Scotland. And in the wake of that, support for that proposition increasing quite considerably during particularly the latter stages of the campaign. So to give you some idea, for most of the campaign, ICM were asking people, well, if Scotland votes no, what do you think should happen? Should the Scottish Parliament keep its existing powers, or should it have much more powers over areas like taxation and welfare? For most of the campaign, it was about 60% saying there should be more powers. But that 60%, half of them at least, consisting of people who were yes supporters. The crucial thing that happened in the last stages of the campaign is that support overall for the idea that the Scottish Parliament needed more power with respect to taxation and welfare benefits increased considerably amongst no supporters. So that whereas even during the summer, only around a half of, increased amongst no supporters. So even during the summer, only around a half of no supporters were saying that they wanted more devolution. By the end of the referendum, 2/3 were wanting to do so. So to that extent, at least, the consequence of the referendum has indeed left support for the constitutional status quo weaker than it ever has been. And what you also need to appreciate, at least, is that the instinctive reaction, and it is an instinctive reaction, the instinctive reaction of most people in Scotland when asked who should be responsible for various policy areas is that if it's domestic, including taxation, including welfare benefits, including pensions, supposedly, they say the decision should be made by Edinburgh. And to that extent, at least, public opinion in Scotland appears to be, and I emphasise the word appears here, to be well ahead of anything that's proposed by the unionist parties in their various proposals, which, by the way, are nothing like as radical as characterised by the Prime Minister at 7 o'clock on Friday morning. He gave the impression that what they were proposing was a substantial devolution of taxation and welfare benefits. None of the unionist parties have proposed that, including the Conservatives. They have proposed not inconsiderable devolution of taxation, but it's primarily income tax. They've all more or less agreed they should devolve housing benefit because the bedroom tax has just made that toxic. But on the welfare side, there's very little offered indeed. Now, however, although public opinion in Scotland says it wants things decided in Edinburgh, if you ask it a different question, such as, is it okay for the basic rate of income tax or the basic state pension to be different in Scotland than it is in England, then you only get 40% supporting that proposition. So to that extent, at least, meeting public opinion and meeting public aspiration is not as straightforward as you might imagine, but so far as where is the legitimate locus for decision-making in the eyes of Scots, they do start off with Edinburgh being in that place. Now, the other thing which isn't sufficiently widely realised is that now that we have gone into this position where we're going to have an attempt to reach an agreement, the process doesn't just simply involve trying to get agreement between three political parties who didn't manage to do it before the referendum, but who at least have a degree of common ground amongst them. It now also involves the SNP, because they're also invited to the talks. And the SNP will argue for far, far more devolution than anything that the Unionist parties has so far proposed. And we also have to remember here, and this is something that really hasn't been picked up in most of the discourse south of the border, is that in principle, at least, the SNP will have a veto in this process. Because under the terms of the Sewell Convention, Westminster does not legislate to change the powers of the Scottish Parliament unless the Scottish Parliament agreed to that. There was a whole argument about the 2012 Scotland Act, which went through. Eventually, Holyrood agreed, but not after criticising it very substantially. Which therefore also means, and this is my final point, a lot of excitement south of the border. Oh, Scotland's just about to get a lot more devolution, so we better do about something in England very quickly. Something isn't going to happen very quickly. The aim is simply to try to get agreement as to what might happen to Scotland in the way of more devolution in advance of the 2015 general election. But the legislation is not going to go through before the 2015 general election. It's going to go through afterwards, through what may be a fairly substantial, lengthy process, and which will also involve the Scottish Parliament. So insofar as people were getting rather exercised about the English question and thinking the English question needed to be solved before the general election, it doesn't. Because, in fact, even the 2012 Scotland Act will not begin to be fully implemented until 2016. And even if legislation is passed in the first term of the next Parliament, it will take years for it to be implemented. So calm down, guys. There is an awful lot of water to pass under, an awful lot of bridge, as well as some very difficult political negotiations to take place. And then England will have to decide what it wants to do when Scotland has sorted itself out.
John Curtis, thanks very much indeed. We're going to ask Sue Cameron, who's a columnist at The Telegraph, for her thoughts now. Sue's got very well-honed Whitehall contacts, and a lot of the questions that were raised in this were contingency plans. Did anyone at Westminster and Whitehall see this coming, or did it really take people by surprise? Sue?
Well, I think one of the big lessons to be drawn from the referendum is that the traditional political parties, the traditional elites, including perhaps the civil service, has simply run out of road. The No campaign struck me. I was there briefly in the middle of August at the Scottish Parliament's Festival of Politics, and the No campaign really did seem to be, when you talk to people, something of a shambles, and it seemed to have been so almost from the outset. And it almost, the result has underlined perhaps the collapse of the traditional parties, the collapse in their membership from millions to 100,000 plus a little bit, the collapse of the turnout, days when 97% of voters voted Labour or Tory. Last general election it was 65%, and it could well be far less next time. And what is the reason for this? And I think one of the main reasons is that people, ordinary people, feel, and we've heard all this often enough, but it's true, the politicians, the political parties, they just take us for granted. They're all the same. They're all in it for themselves. And one of the things that we've seen underlined also in the Scottish referendum is the rise of perhaps individual conviction politicians, the importance of the power of personality over the power of party. People like Alex Salmond, people like Gordon Brown, Nigel Farage, Boris Johnson. Now, one aspect, it seems to me, where all of these people can connect with ordinary voters in a way that the traditional party leaders just don't seem to be able to do. And one sign, this isn't the politicians, but one sign of the way the political elite is out of touch is perhaps the civil service. Just under 3 weeks ago, Sir Jeremy Hayward, the top civil servant, cabinet secretary, head of the civil service, went before MPs on the Public Administration Select Committee and said there had been no contingency planning against the possibility that Scotland might go independent. And when the MP said, why not? He said, well, the Prime Minister told us not to do any contingency planning. And we are good civil servants, and we always do what we're told. We were only obeying orders. Where have we heard that one before? And it seems to me that if it's true, it is quite astounding. I mean, it is either perhaps a gross dereliction of duty, or maybe Sir Jeremy was being, in the hallowed words of Whitehall, economical with the truth. But just consider what might have happened with no contingency planning if the Scots had voted for independence. And never mind the political fallout. I mean, I think the Prime Minister Cameron would certainly have had to resign if the Scots had gone off. But if you just look at the mechanics of government, there are, according to the Institute for Government, there are 44,000 civil servants in Scotland. 17,000 of them work for the Scottish Government, and the other 27,000 work for the UK Government. Almost every department in Whitehall has civil servants operating in Scotland. I think there's only 5 of them that don't. And imagine what would have happened the day that it was announced that the Scots were going to leave. What would have happened to the 27,000 UK civil servants? Would they have been given the chance to join the Scottish Government? Would they all have been ordered to go south? Would they have been given a choice? Would they have been offered compensation if they didn't want to do any of those things? And what would have happened in terms of setting up the new Scottish Government, the new Scottish administration? What would have happened for because they'd have needed one, the new Scottish Ministry of Defence? Would there have been cooperation between UK civil servants and the new Scottish Government? Or would the Scottish Government have started from scratch? No contingency planning? I mean, it just seems incredible that there was no contingency planning. It's bad enough when governments tinker with the Whitehall machinery, with departments. We saw quite a lot of it under the last Labour government. They were quite keen on, for a while at any rate, on closing down departments, setting up new ones, merging others, spending millions on a new logo. And the result was always the same. It was always, nearly always, damaging to good government, to the actual business in hand, which is looking after the public and pursuing the policies of their ministers. Because what civil servants do, and you can't blame them, once they're told that it's all changed, they start wondering, well, have I got to reapply for my job? Where do I sit? What's the mission of this new setup? Who's in charge? Am I going to be paid more or less? And they spend all their time, understandably, as I say, directing their energies to that and not concentrating on what should actually happen. And that was just, and when we saw it happening under Labour, there was that glorious moment when Labour actually tried to abolish the Lord Chancellor's department overnight, and I think the Scottish office, funnily enough, and little men were all over Whitehall taking down the nameplates. And then the next day, when they realised you can't do that because both the Secretary of State for Scotland and the Lord Chancellor, who goes back 800 years, are mentioned in dozens and dozens of existing Acts of Parliament. Their consent is required or they have to be consulted. And you can't just abolish them. So the workforce was sent out again with its screwdrivers to put all the little nameplates back on again. And that was really tinkering with government. This, if the splitting of the state had happened, this would have been an absolute earthquake. Now, there is a possibility that Sir Jeremy wasn't being totally straight with the MPs when he insisted that there was no contingency planning. I asked one very senior former Mandarin, what do you think of Jeremy saying there's no contingency planning? And he said it, he sounded so like Victor Meldrew, it wasn't true. He said, "I don't believe it. They must have done some contingency planning. The Treasury must have done some contingency planning." Well, he was right about the Treasury. We know the Treasury had been doing some contingency planning. So Nicholas Macpherson, the top civil servant there, had actually published his advice on the currency to the Chancellor. And they admitted under pressure that, yes, of course, when things were looking very dodgy, they admitted that they'd got a team together. But that still raises questions, if Sir Jeremy was not being economical with the truth, as to why there was no contingency planning elsewhere. Is it possible, there has been speculation, that ages ago Sir Jeremy warned the Prime Minister that going down this road, and particularly the way they were doing it, could be very, very dangerous and they should think much harder about it? And was he ignored? Well, maybe it's possible. But it still raises questions as to why he actually said no contingency planning. Why not fall back on the old, tried and tested Whitehall formula, which for years has been to say, we have contingency plans for everything, and we don't talk about them in public. I mean, obviously they've got contingency plans for terrorist attacks, for invasions. If they haven't, then the military should be taken out and shot. And of course they don't discuss them in public for obvious reasons. Why should this have been any different? And it seems to me that the heart of the British Civil Service, at the heart of the British Civil Service and the confidence that the public have had in it for so long, is the whole idea of political neutrality, of public service, of sometimes being above any particular group of politicians, any particular government. They have a duty, I would say, I think many of them would say, of stewardship to the public. And I think that if it's really true that there was no contingency planning, then in future this must raise serious questions about whether there was a betrayal, perhaps, of civil service values, even of trust.
There's a lot of meat there and a lot to come back to from Sue Cameron. Thanks very much. I'm going to introduce Neil Acheson now. Many of you will know Neil from his writing, his journalism. I learnt during the campaign that he'd also fought for his country, and perhaps you can bring in some of the sort of the cultural elements that this brought up as well for us, Neil.
Well, maybe the cultural elements can follow. I was a yes voter. I voted yes. I also campaigned across Scotland, but not specifically with my group for a yes or no, but for what sort of Scotland? Make people talk about their visions, hopes, dreams, you know, but not because it was too serious, too big an issue to say vote this, vote that. We wanted to make people, help people to think and dream. What I would say about the campaign is simply this. I think that you can put it under a headline, which is, yes, won the campaign and lost the vote. Now, something on terms, very briefly and dogmatically. Let's stop saying a number of things. Let's stop saying Britain is a nation. Britain, it can be a nation state, a slightly different definition, or it can be a state. That's different. Secondly, let's stop saying, as disgracefully, the Observer and the Independent, those grave liberal organs, described the Yes campaign as, I quote, atavistic ethnic chauvinism or nationalism. That was unbelievable. Enough said. Third request, let's never describe what the unionist parties are currently offering, if they ever make up their minds exactly what it is, as Devo Max. That is not what Devo Max means. That itself is, of course, a vague, blurry term, but it is a spectrum which, I don't know, it seems to me to move from, on the one end of the spectrum, full fiscal responsibility for taxation, for raising money for government expenditure in Scotland, right to the other end, which is really total sort of Gladstonian federal status, in which everything, all government, is done in Scotland except for foreign affairs and defence. Whatever you look at it, what is being apparently on offer is not even at close to one end of that spectrum. Let's get that out of the way, I think. What's the situation now? Well, as you may or may not have heard Piers Morgan's opinion on this, which was, okay, Scots, you've had your fun. Now just quietly vote no, and we'll say no more about it. Well, what's happened, in fact, is, of course, that something deeply un-British has taken place, which is that a defeated party, and make no bones about it, I mean, 10% is a hell of a defeat for the SNP and for a campaign. A defeated party has doubled its membership in 5 days after the defeat. And what does this mean? We don't yet know. You can say, well, it's partly the non-SNP yes campaign crowding on board. May even be a proportion of aghast and dismayed people who voted no and wished for various reasons they didn't. Now, it seems to me that the statement, which goes all around Scotland, which is Scotland has changed forever during this campaign. Well, it might be true, but it assumes that this mobilization which has taken place will keep moving, which is a question. And secondly, which is true, I think, that actually both sides have now, by the end of the campaign, accepted that independence is a serious option for the future of Scotland. It is an option which one side hates and denounces, the other side admires and embraces, but it is serious and there. It is not anything else. Next, really following from what John Curtis has said, the idea that the Union is now the settled will of the Scottish people for all time is ridiculous. That's not the case, and it's very misleading. Independence is not off the agenda for a generation, unless when you ask people, for instance, Nicola Sturgeon, what is a generation? She replied in course to say 15 years, which may, of course, refer to the dreadfully low life expectation of many Scots.
Oh, God.
But, well, you know, 54 years for an adult male in Glasgow. It's not funny, really. It's one of the reasons I voted yes. Anyway, yes. What seems to me to come out of the result, among other things, is this. First of all, it expressed something which is unchanged almost for something like 35 to 40 years, which is that what the biggest single identifiable group of Scottish people seem to want, or say they want, is to govern ourselves as other small countries do, and if possible, do that within the United Kingdom. Now, that, of course, was not on offer. It corresponds to this Devo Max area, which was carefully kept off the voting paper. The other thing is, very briefly, and again, John knows much more about this than I do, but I've watched for nearly 40 years now the presence of this obstinate preference for an independent Scotland among people who are absolutely dependably Labour voters in Scotland. There always has been that group. There was a period, I think, in the 1970s, but actually the biggest single number of people who wanted independence as a constitutional option also said they would always vote Labour and never vote anything else, vote for a unionist party. What happens now? Well, first of all, the SNP really has to internalise the scale of its defeat. Government and opposition will actually probably fudge their way out of this, their conflicting commitments and all the business about English votes for English laws. Probably we may talk about that later. The English question, the West Lothian question, to which one Scottish answer has always been, so what? And indeed, you can legitimately ask, who cares about it? Who does care about it? Well, the answer is that anybody who wants to destroy the Labour Party cares about it, and anybody who wants to, or destroy the Labour Party's capacity to govern effectively in England cares about it, and the Labour Party itself cares about it. Anybody else? Well, that's a question. So without going into that too deeply,
We can pick up if you,
yeah, I'll finish up just by saying two things. There are two obvious crises ahead, it seems to me. One is 2015. What would happen if the SNP won? And it is now in ramping form with this doubling of membership. What would happen if it won most of the Labour seats and suddenly appeared at Westminster in the guise of like the Irish Party, which actually held the balance of power between, I think, 1910 and 1914? That is a possibility, it seems to me. Secondly, EU referendum coming up. Now, my figure is slightly different from John Curtis's because I think there was a Chatham House poll very recently which said that the Scottish preference to stay in the EU was 59%, and that this was the only British UK region which wanted to stay in the EU at all, with the exception of London, which wanted to stay by a much narrower margin. So there is the possibility, two possibilities, probabilities of collision, really quite close ahead.
Neil Asherton, thank you very much indeed. And we will be taking questions on the sort of the what-ifs that Neil's raised. Professor Malcolm Chalmers is the research director at RUSI, has had rather a busy week, in a week where we've all but declared war on ISIS. Now, Scotland must feel a long time ago, but perhaps you can take us back to your thoughts as they were, Malcolm.
As they were a week ago. Well, I'm a Scot who didn't vote in the referendum last week because I live here, but I would have voted no if there had been one. But I agree with Neil that this issue is not over. The size of that yes vote, the resurgence in SNP membership, means that as long as the Scots keep electing the SNP to government in Edinburgh, the issue of referenda will come back. And I think the generation may be even shorter than Neil suggests if that continues to happen. In the end, the union will only be secure if unionist parties are able to win seats in the Edinburgh Parliament and indeed to displace the SNP as the government in Edinburgh. And that's a challenge, I think, most of all for the Labour Party. The Labour Party has to address whether they've got it right since devolution. Some leading key Scottish Labour figures like Donald Dewar in the Scottish Parliament at the beginning, that has to be addressed. But it also has to be addressed, I think, by the Conservative Party. It's striking in the referendum that some of the areas in which the no vote won were areas which are actually held by the SNP in the Scottish Parliament. 20% of SNP voters voted no. So those are people who I think the Conservative Party in places like Murray might well have a chance of getting. And of course, there's only one Conservative MP in Westminster from Scotland, but there are 15 Conservative members of the Scottish Parliament. The Conservative Party is not a dead party in Scotland by any means, and that's something in which perhaps they can build, in which they would have some support. So number one, this is not the end. It's going to be hard. It's going to be, in the end, about the Scottish Parliament. Secondly, raising the English question is asking a question to which there is no satisfactory answer. And some of the debates around that remind me of the debates, sometimes from the same people, actually, Conservative members of Parliament, in their attitude towards the European Union. They're asking questions. They're highlighting dilemmas in relations with the European Union, between the UK and the European Union, to which they don't expect a satisfactory answer, but they're raising the contradictions. And there are contradictions, constitutional contradictions. But if you followed the logic of English votes for English laws, which would apply to most areas of domestic policy in England, certainly as devolution continues, but even now, then why is English sovereignty only to be applied to legislation? Why doesn't it apply to the executive? Why, if you can have essentially an English parliament sitting within a Westminster Parliament, why shouldn't you have an English government sitting within a British government? We read of a situation, actually interesting. The shadow cabinet, only, three members of the shadow cabinet are from Scottish constituencies, a party which is quite heavily Scottish in some ways. Their three portfolios are the Scotland Office, international development and foreign affairs, two of the only areas which are actually purely union matters rather than devolved matters. That sort of thing will inevitably happen informally. But if you actually start formalizing it, then what I worry about is a scenario, and this is perhaps too extreme a comparison, but I think it's a useful comparison. What in the end led to the collapse of the Soviet Union was not unrest in the periphery, although clearly in the Baltic republics in particular there was. It's when the Russian Federation it gained power, and you had that contradiction between Yeltsin and Gorbachev and Moscow, and Russia declared independence, and some of the other states actually didn't know for a few months they actually had become independent out in Central Asia. So in asymmetric states, it's deeply dangerous if the largest unit gains so much independent power of its own that it actually starts rivaling the center. And actually the same thing happened with the breakup of the Union of Serbia and Montenegro. Third point I wanted to make is that some of the elements of the debate about Scottish separation from the UK sound uncomfortably like the sort of debate we would have if we have a referendum on the European Union in 2017. There again, I suspect we'd be struggling with the same competition between, on the one hand, hearts and emotions and loyalty, which will all be about Britain, and on the other hand, cost-benefit analysis about all the terrible economic catastrophe which will happen if we withdraw. And of course, there'll be experts on every side on the latter, so people will not know what to think. All, I suspect, the Get Out, I don't know whether it'll be a yes or no, actually, but the Get Out campaign in that referendum will need to do is convince the British population that the NHS is at risk if we don't get out of the European Union, and they will win their argument. And the final point, if I may, Emily, is this, which is that when people outside Europe look at what's happening in the UK, they worry. Many of our allies and partners, countries friendly to this country around the world, were very worried about what was happening in Scotland over the last month as they woke up to the possibility of a yes vote. But many of them don't see what's happening in the UK in isolation. They see it as a wider trend across Europe where issues of governance, of political order, as a result of the Eurozone crisis, as a result of the rise of the right in Northern Europe, especially as a result of separatist movements. Europe is in a period of political flux which we've never been in for a very long, certainly since World War II. And today, of all the major centers of economic and military power in the world, US, China, Japan, Brazil, even India, I think to some extent, Europe is the center which is in greatest political flux internationally. And that's having, I think, a very serious reputation, serious impact on the reputation of this country, but also of Europe as a whole.
Malcolm, thanks very much indeed. We're going to get some roving mics, so yes, let's just crack straight on. I saw you first.
Thanks, Chair. Carl Wright, Secretary General of the Commonwealth Local Government Forum, and maybe one of the last points Professor Chambers mentioned, I was pleased that on polling day the Telegraph published a letter which I'd expressed grave concern. I'd expressed from colleagues in Africa and elsewhere about what the impact of a Scottish breakaway would mean on their countries, and issue perhaps that wasn't brought up very much. Obviously in Catalonia it was brought up. But the question I wanted to put to the panel is really whether the issue of decentralization of powers to the big cities in England and Scotland is part of the answer. Yesterday, I think the leaders of Manchester and Birmingham, other big cities, wrote to William Hague requesting greater fiscal and other devolution. And of course, Britain, indeed Scotland, still is one of the most centralized countries in Europe and indeed the Commonwealth. I mean, places like Johannesburg and Delhi can issue municipal bonds. Swedish and German cities have lots of things. So the question is that part of the answer also for cities like Glasgow, which want to have more self-determination? And finally, just to say that it's an issue that the Scottish Government is going to be hosting an event in Edinburgh on this very question at the end of October. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Just to make sure everyone got that, decentralisation of power in northern cities, is that of England, and as you said, in Glasgow. Sue, do you want to give us your thoughts on that?
I think one of the, excuse me, one of the things that is sometimes left out of this, and particularly you mentioned the northern cities, but particularly in relation to London, which has 7, 8 million people, whereas Scotland's only got 5 million. And they say, well, it's ludicrous that that London shouldn't have more or less the same self-government as Scotland. And it ignores the whole of our history. London isn't a nation. Scotland is, and that makes a huge, huge difference. I mean, we can't go back over 1,000 years to the sort of the era of the heptarchy when England was divided into 7 kingdoms. And I think that that is something that people ignore. I also think that the people who are really interested often in decentralisation are the people who make their livings out of government, either because they're politicians or they're civil servants or they're journalists who write about it or they're academics who write about it. And they're the ones that are really, really keen on greater decentralisation. And I don't think the rest of the people are, and they don't vote for it. They didn't vote for a region, a separate region in the northeast, and they're pretty unkeen on elected mayors.
We've got a lot to get through, so I'm going to take a few questions. I saw your hand, and then I'll ask you and you, sir. Yeah.
Kirsty Hughes, I wanted to pick up on something Neil said that Malcolm came to at the end, so the Europe in flux question, because you said, Neil, that the Observer and Independent must stop talking about ethnic chauvinism, but apart from the Spanish Catalonia question leading to these ridiculous threats that negotiations could take 8 years for an independent Scotland, there was a lot of concern in Brussels about the nationalistic implications. So, and yet Scotland was a wonderful revitalisation of politics in a tired continent. So how do you persuade Brussels, and how do you make it that lesson? I mean, there was that rather shocking photo of the Donetsk Republic supports Scottish independence. And just a very quick follow-up question. You defined Devo Max, as it has been defined, as all powers except foreign policy and defence. And I've never understood how you could get that in a European Union. How could you, because that covers so many domestic issues. So is Devo Max possible within the European Union?
Neil, just bear this in mind, because I'm going to come back to you on this one. How do you persuade Brussels, then, that what one person calls chauvinism can be a real energising of a country in a sort of a positive nationalistic way? Sir?
Yeah, Keith Raffan, former MP and former MSP. I mean, I presume Neil Acheson was just joking when he said that 45% was a hell of a defeat. And if you go 15, 20 years ago, the independence vote was running between 30-35. So this is a remarkable increase. That's the first point. And the second point is really about these forthcoming all-party talks. Basically, the course of them is fairly easy to predict, isn't it? That they will break down round about March, just shortly before the dissolution of Parliament, and the SNP will walk out. The SNP will then go into the election campaign, campaigning on, independence, I suppose.
And you think they could steal Westminster from Labour, do you?
No, I'm not saying that. I think that's a little bit overambitious. John Curtis is the expert on that. God is the expert on that, not me. But yeah, I mean, so certainly it would give them a chance of making substantial gains.
Okay, Neil, another one for you then. 45% should be seen as a massive victory, not a defeat. And there was a question here.
Jim Shannon, I'm a Member of Parliament for Strangford, Northern Ireland. Very interested, John, in your comments about Northern Ireland. If the vote had happened, the last national opinion poll in Northern Ireland indicated only 21% of nationalists were in favour of United Ireland. So I think we had probably one of hands down if it had come to the occasion. I want to ask the question, if I can, to the panel. The question is, what sort of... I look upon myself as an Ulster Scot, but also British. How can we persuade those people who are in the independence, who are seeking independence, that they can be Scottish and British? And what sort of federal system of government would they like to see within the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland?
Thank you very much. Malcolm, I'm going to start with you, because I think that one feels like it's your territory, and then we'll work back on the early ones.
You know, I think the background to the rise of the independence movement in Scotland is the marginalisation economically of Scotland and the north of England, and the perception of that marginalisation. And that's evident in the way, I think, in which there's such a large proportion of the Labour vote in the west of Scotland voted yes. And it's evident in the fact that one of the key correlates of yes voting was social class. that people in lower, who felt they had less to lose were much more likely to vote yes than those who felt they weren't. And that's why lots of SNP areas actually voted no, and quite a lot of Labour areas. Western Bartonshire, where the Trident nuclear submarines are based, voted yes. So if that's part of the diagnosis, I think part of the answer has to be about economics, and it may be empowering cities in the area of economics and giving them more money. It's not simply empowerment, it's resources. It will start changing that. I mean, I have a house in the north of England, talked to a lot of people in Yorkshire, and I was surprised by how many of my friends in Yorkshire said if they had been Scottish, they would have voted yes. So it's partly about the north-south divide in the country. Now, is there a simple answer to that? Of course there's not, but I think unless you address that, it's not really, I mean, I don't think the people in Glasgow who've never voted before voted yes because they believe passionately in some particular way of organising who they pay income tax to, if indeed they pay income tax at all. It's everybody in Scotland feels very passionately Scottish, I think. But to separate from the union is, I think, driven by an idea that economically they would be better off. We have to tackle that.
Neil, can you address for us perhaps sort of two halves of your same response? Are the all-party talks destined for failure? And how do you convince Brussels that those people who might want to believe in nationalism in their country are not chauvinists, are not jingoists?
Well, I mean, to take the first one first, my impression of what Europeans thought about the whole referendum is not entirely in line with what's been said, because I've just heard an endless stream of go for it, what kept you, you know, from Poles, Italians, people in France even, to some extent in Germany, you know, even the United States, oddly enough. And I think the principle of a nation which would like also to have a state seems so obvious to people, particularly in Europe with its experience, that it's sort of a no-brainer, as they say. So I don't think that's the idea that you want. Look, I mean, the idea, the sort of silly syllogism, let's say, which is nationalism equals racism equals fascism equals war, is a peculiarly British thing, and it sort of belongs to the old left of the Labour Party, and it is really hopelessly unsophisticated and shows ignorance
Malcolm's
of history.
looking so doubtful, I've got to bring you in. What's that expression?
Well, I mean, Scotland's clearly different, and there's a civic nationalism in Scotland. I accept that, although quite a lot of people on the no side felt an atmosphere in Scotland during the campaign which was not respectful of their views, and you know, there was a nasty side to the Yes campaign, even though the leadership wasn't part of that. But there was a nasty side on the, and I don't necessarily think that would get better if there were independence. But the phenomenon of nationalism in Europe as a whole is exactly the way you've characterised it, and the rise of you've characterised it as not being the case. If you look at if you look at separatism in Bosnia. If you look at separatism in Belgium, which is very, very ethnic and language-based, time and again, that's the case. And if we start opening up this Pandora's box in Europe, then there are demonstration effects from one place to another. And if people think that even in a country like our own, where the Scots are not oppressed, where they have a very important part at the table, where we have a 300-year union, where the social links are so strong between our two countries. You know, everybody I talk to, they've relatives on both sides of the border. If even we cannot work together, what hope is there for a European Union of what we constructed after World War II?
Let's go back to our audience because we're fairly short on time. Yes.
Elizabeth Balson, I'm a member of the Institute. I had an email yesterday from a Yorkshire friend, and it was about her sister and brother-in-law who live in Scotland, and they were saying they were very fearful of what the future held for them if the vote had gone to yes, and that they'd seen some unpleasant things on behalf, by nationalists, though she doesn't specify what those were. And they are now very fearful of what the future holds for them. And I wonder what the panel thinks about that. And by the way, I'm originally from Devonshire, and you can't be more ignored than the far southwest.
Understood. Thank you.
And also, I do worry very much about the West Lothian question. Partly that stems from being from Devonshire and the Barnett formula, but it would take too long to go and explain.
Okay, well, let's come on to that. There are a few other hands. Let's just take a few. Sir.
Pasquale Oselli, member of Chatham House. First question is about the British national sentiment. I'm a foreigner myself, so. Mr. Acheson said there is no such thing as a British nation. Well, I think he referred to the romantic view of one blood, one faith, one language, or perhaps something more ethnic. But then who would be Benjamin Disraeli? He wasn't known of them, I mean, in terms of that very strict sense. The other thing, what from an well, I can't agree from the international perspective. I do travel in Europe a lot. There was a lot of people saying, go for it. Most of the people in Europe were horrified because most of the people in Europe didn't make sense to see somebody who isn't oppressed just going for nation state, things which is anachronistic. Then a comment on that. Third thing, the same common sense parties that have campaigned for no in Scotland should then campaign for the no on a referendum on UK in Europe then. I mean, I suppose. Otherwise, then would be their nonsense, and that could be the last stroke who would break the United Kingdom.
Okay. Thank you very much. We're trying to get through quite a lot, so try and keep your points single or simple if you can. Are there any more hands that I've missed? Let's go to you, sir.
In the great debates, defence and foreign affairs seem to play rather a small part in the No campaign. Would the No campaign have done better if it had emphasised defence and foreign affairs?
Thank you very much. So should there have been more, well, not that you would care on the yes side, but should there have been more emphasis on defence for the No team? And there was one more, sir, I think it was you, was it? Yeah.
John Wilson, a member of the Institute and a journalist. A quick question. With hindsight, was Tony Blair wise in opening the box?
John, will you kick us off? We might as well do this in reverse order. So 97, did the beginnings of devolution push the referendum away, or do you think that was the Pandora's box?
I mean, we got to where we got as a mixture of unintended consequences and unanticipated events. The unanticipated consequence of creating a Scottish Parliament is that you invited voters in Scotland to think of what was best for Scotland's interests in an election, rather than for the UK as a whole. And in asking them that question, they came back the answer, well, actually, if you ask us that question, we think the SNP are rather good. So one of the things we discovered from very, very on in devolution is that people are more willing to vote for the SNP in a Scottish Parliament election than they are in a Westminster election. So that's a crucial thing. So far from killing nationalism stone dead, politically, nationalism was given a lifeline in terms of electoral support, and then a lifeline in the sense that for the first time in its life, the SNP became a serious parliamentary party. In becoming a serious parliamentary party with substantial full-time politicians, they also had a situation in which they had their first 11 in the Scottish Parliament. The Labour Party, partly through the misfortune of things like Donald Dewar's death and Henry McLeish getting a muddle over his expenses, very rapidly ended up with its second 11 in the Scottish Parliament. And when you come to the 2011 campaign, that gap was very clear to voters and then became iconically represented when the Scottish Labour Party fought its campaign and said, now that those nasty Tories are back in power in London, you need us to defend Scotland against the Tories. But unfortunately, in a very iconic event in Glasgow Central Railway Station, the then leader of the Scottish Labour Party, Ian Gray, was hustled out of Glasgow Central Railway Station at a media event when he was accosted by left-wing activists was pushed through the front door of a Subway sandwich shop and out the back door. And that became an icon for the fact, actually, the Scottish Labour Party are incapable of defending Scotland's interests. They don't have a programme for running government in Scotland. And basically, the SNP look as though they're far better able to run the country. So therefore, so that's the unanticipated event. That basically, the reason why we had this referendum is that in 2011, the Scottish Labour Party, which had a variety of structural weaknesses already, completely made a mess of its election campaign. Which is why when you're talking about the future of the Union, frankly, the future of the Scottish Labour Party becomes crucial. If the Scottish Labour Party remains as structurally weak as it currently is, the SNP are always going to be your best bet for being the largest party in the Scottish Parliament. If the Scottish Labour Party can overcome its structural weaknesses, then maybe things will become rather different.
John, thanks very much. I'm conscious it's 2 o'clock. If anyone has to run away, feel free to creep out. We're almost at an end. Neil, do you want to come in on that one, or do you want to come in on... No, I want to come back to something yes.
you said earlier.
Yes, exactly. I was going to bring you in. Perhaps you can look at two areas again. This idea of the British nation and Disraeli as where do we sit in that? And also for the lady who said, you know, if you have relatives who voted no, who are now feeling that possibly they're not comfortable.
Well. The question of is Britain a nation or not leads endlessly to, it's a huge, long discussion about terminology and definitions. All I would say is just to repeat that nationalism in Scotland is painfully civic. Scotland, there existed a kingdom of Scotland hundreds of years before anybody spoke about a Scottish people. The biggest cheer I heard at a mass meeting in 1992, back at the European Summit, was when William McIlvanney, the novelist, said, "We are a mongrel culture." And a huge audience all rose to their feet and cheered. And that is not, you know, this kind of nationalism which people are afraid of. But I wanted just briefly to come back to something which was raised and not discussed. This question of decentralization to cities, for example. Now, one absolutely constantly recurring element which we found touring Scotland was the grievance of inadequate local government and local responsibility. Everybody said communities must govern themselves more. The local government, you know, arrangement in Scotland is far too centralized, it's unresponsive. And in the end, you realize they were talking about, you know, a very European concept of subsidiarity, power starting from the grassroots. Now, the difficulty about the SNP, and they were heavily criticized often, is they're a centralizing party in many ways. And that is absolutely against the Scottish grain, because Scotland is wildly disparate. So in just in Scottish terms, something has to happen. Yes, responsibility to cities is very, very important, and giving them more self-government. But it's not just cities, it's all over. It requires a completely different attitude to the power flow. Maybe it requires a revolution, I don't know. But it should, you know, this is the main thing that people wanted. They felt disempowered, they felt ill-governed, badly governed by people who didn't listen to them, and they wanted a complete reform of local government. And that obviously applies in slightly different terms to England as well.
I mean, can I just say one other thing? I mean,
very briefly.
Argues about Britishness and Scottishness. One of the things you need to realise is that basically Scottishness is ubiquitous in Scotland. Virtually everybody in Scotland has a strong sense of Scottish identity. What divides Scotland and what the referendum was really about is how British it is. And that's, there's a much more variation amongst the Scottish population as to whether or not people feel British or not. But then at the end of the day, the reason why the referendum was so much about economics and about instrumental consequences is you were talking, therefore, about a population, virtually all of whom felt strongly Scottish, but many of whom also felt British, and therefore were trying to work out how to answer a question where actually identity did not simply provide the answer, because they do feel a degree of both, and that therefore the argument is about the instrumental consequences, and people would go with their Scottish identity if they thought it was going to be instrumentally beneficial, and they would go with their British identity if they thought it wouldn't be.
Right. And that brings us to the last question about defence, which I'm going to ask you, Malcolm, to tackle for us. It seems rather fitting to close on that in Chatham House. But if the No campaign, and of course they did have a considerable victory, but if they had played up not just the currency union, which was pretty early and pretty frequent, but also the difficulties with moving Trident and the defence capabilities and what happens when you lose half your soldiers, your troops, would that have been a stronger card?
I'm not convinced that it would have done that. One of the interesting little wrinkles in the last couple of weeks is, would we have had a parliamentary vote so late in the process in relation to Iraq if we hadn't had a referendum last week? And I would submit that it's quite likely that we would have got to the stage of the parliamentary vote we're having tomorrow, maybe in advance of the Americans doing what they've done, rather than behind. But the government, I think actually quite rightly, didn't want to take the risk of another war in Iraq becoming an issue in the Scotland vote, quite rightly. And that reflects the way in which the defence issue could have played worse for the No campaign rather than better. The second point I think I would make is this, that I think, and there were quite a number of interventions from military figures, and I think some of them were quite sensible, but some of them were not, and were appealing to the history of the British Armed Forces in a way which didn't seem very relevant to concerns today. And the last point would be this, that if you have to make a defence and security argument, you have to make an argument that speaks to the security concerns of Scots today. Emotion only takes you so far. It has to be about current concerns. And we actually do live in a pretty insecure world that's becoming more insecure. But I don't think yet the debate in Scotland is one people don't feel insecure in that respect. In 20 or 30 years, yes, but they don't feel that yet. And I think that's the area in which perhaps more could have been done. For me, the greatest security risk, if there had been a yes vote in that transition, because there would have been a long transition. In the end, I think Scotland could have created its own defence forces just the same as Denmark or other small NATO countries. It would have been a transition. The biggest danger would have been with the security services, combating terrorism and organised crime and so on, which are immediate threats, which could impact on Scotland, and which cooperation between the two were essential. And I think the SNP did get away with quite a lot of arguments which should have been more firmly challenged in that area.
Malcolm, thanks very much. I'm going to wrap us up here now because I'm very conscious that you've given up your lunch times for this. But a big thanks to our guests, to Malcolm Chalmers, to Neil Acheson, to Sue Cameron and to John Curtis. And thank you all very much for your participation, for coming along. Thank you.